I'm Elizabeth at A Literary Princess. If you are new here, welcome. I am a 6-year PhD candidate in English literature with a focus on Victorian women novelists. And as you might expect, I love to read. Today I have my November wrap-up for you. I read 13 books in November, which is really good. I'm honestly surprised because I was basically out of commission for a week with COVID. And I also didn't finish 2 books, which is very unusual for me. I tend to not DNF things. However, we'll talk about those at the end. I was participating in Nonfiction November, hosted by Olive from A Book Olive. The whole idea is to read nonfiction in November. 3 of these reads count for that. So, let's jump in. First up, we start with a reread that I began right at the end of October because it was the season. This is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This is one of my favorite books ever. It is kind of the original dark academia book. It follows a group of students at a liberal arts college in Vermont who are studying classics and what happens when they kill one of their classmates. That's not a spoiler. It's the first page. Like I said, this is one of my favorite books. I love it. The atmosphere is perfect for fall, perfect for walking around campus on a kind of cloudy gray day with the leaves falling, which is why I was walking through campus and was like, I need to read The Secret History again. So I love this. I don't really have much else to say about it other than that it was 5 stars. Next up is an audiobook that I actually read mostly in October but didn't finish until November. This is You Let Me In by Camilla Bruce. This book's amazing. Oh my goodness. I don't even know what genre to call it. It's fantasy. Maybe. It's kind of a mystery, but not quite in the traditional sense. Is it horror? There's horrific parts of it. This is the story of Cassandra Tripp, who is, as an adult, a reclusive novelist who had been accused but acquitted of murdering her husband. When she disappears, her will goes into action, leaving her property and estate to her niece and nephew if they read the story of her life that she has written and find within that story the password to then give to the executor of the will. And her story is disturbing and strange and involves fairies that nobody else can see, who feed off of her blood and who can reanimate bodies. And the whole question you're asking yourself the whole time is this real? Are there actually fairies? Or is she crazy like everyone else seems to think? Her mother thinks she's crazy. She has a therapist who wrote a book on her who claims that her whole idea of these fairies is basically a delusion that she invented because of childhood trauma. You're asking yourself, did she murder her husband or does it happen how she says? It is so edge of your seat, twisty and turny, and you're just not sure the entire time what's real, what's not. Is this woman crazy? I loved it. Oh, this is such a great, creepy rendition of the Fae. Like, perfect. I adored this. It was 5 stars. The audiobook narrator was really good. Who narrated the audiobook? I should say that. The audiobook was narrated by Claire Rushbrook, who did an amazing job. I just highly recommend this one. So good. Next up, we have a book that I had borrowed from a friend and have since returned because I'd had it for like 2 years now and hadn't read it. This is The Flight of Gemma Hardy by Margot Livesey. I don't know how to pronounce her name. We all know here that I can't pronounce anything. This is a retelling of Jane Eyre set in the 50s and 60s, and it is following a girl named Gemma who's originally from Iceland, but when her parents die is taken to live with her uncle and aunt and cousins in Scotland. However, her uncle then dies and her aunt very much resents her. You can see the Jane Eyre similarities. She is sent off to school. It's a horrible school. She ends up going as a governess to a young girl on this remote island, and the girl's guardian and her begin a love, a romance. And until he has a secret that is revealed that causes her to leave. So this was okay. Like, the writing was good, and I generally enjoyed reading it. The part at the school was the best part. I would have read a whole book that was just at the school because there was so much interesting stuff going on. The dynamics between the different girls, between the teachers and the students. And then there was this whole supernatural element there that really never gets dealt with enough, in my opinion. Honestly, I think this book suffered from being a Jane Eyre retelling because it's following the plot beats of Jane Eyre, but it just wasn't able to do the Thornfield Hall part of the story nearly as well. I found the romance between Gemma and I don't even remember his name very lackluster. Very little build up to it. There was no chemistry. I didn't believe it. And then his secret was super lame. Like, not wife in the attic level. Not even like leave the guy level. Honestly. So, yeah. I did like that it has Gemma going out and kind of searching for more about her Icelandic ancestry. That was interesting. And like I said, the part at the school was fantastic, and I would have loved just a book set at the school. So this was okay, but not my favorite. I gave it 3 stars. I am glad that I read it, and I had a good conversation about it with my friend who lent it to me. Next up is the first of my nonfiction November reads. This is How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman. This is exactly what it sounds like. It is kind of taking you through the day in the life of a regular Victorian, talking about what getting up in the morning was like, what washing up was like, what having breakfast, getting dressed, all this stuff. It was super interesting, and I really appreciate that Goodman focused on like average people instead of the upper class people. This is mostly about working and middle class and what their lives were like. I also appreciated that she mentioned that she would talk about the differences between the different decades, because the Victorian era lasted a really long time, and there were some immense changes from its beginning in 1837 to the end in 1901. Just astounding leaps in technology, differences in fashion. So I'm so glad that she addressed that. Ruth Goodman is a historian and apparently has been in like documentary type series, and I really want to watch some of them. I've actually found a few on YouTube where she's like, a day in a Victorian school or stuff like that, and I really want to watch those because I enjoyed her writing a lot. It's very easy to read. You don't need to be an academic to read this. It's meant for a general audience. So yeah, this was 4 stars. I am so glad that I finally got to it. Next up, we have a reread, which I picked up again because 2 reasons. First, because Steph Morgan had just read it at my recommendation, and I heard her talk about it in both in her vlog and her wrap up, and I was like, I want to reread this. But then also because I started another book that has like a lot of similarities and ended up DNFing that, but was still wanted like that type of book, and I was like, this is House of Salt and Sorrow. We'll do that. So this is House of Salt and Sorrows by Erin A. Craig. It is a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses following, I can't remember names, Annalee, who is I forget which number daughter, but all her older sisters have been dying off one by one. They live in this manor by the ocean that is so atmospheric. Her father has remarried and the new wife is now pregnant. And then again, her sisters are dying, and then all of a sudden it seems like her youngest sister might be seeing the ghosts of the dead sisters, and some creepy stuff starts happening. And also they start going to these balls through this magical doorway, and it's all getting a little bit sketchy. Like I said, this is so atmospheric. I love it so much. I'm glad that I reread it. It is a gothic fantasy. It does such a good job retelling the 12 Dancing Princesses too. It does the best thing that you can possibly do. If you were going to have all 12 sisters, kill a bunch of them off right away. Dead before it even starts, because 12 is so many and so difficult to actually create as characters. But if you kill a bunch of them off, then you don't have to deal with as many. I loved this the first time. I loved it the second time. I'd actually forgotten enough of it that I was still like kinda, oh, like I was remembering as I was reading. I was like, oh yeah, this is gonna happen. But there were things that I'd completely forgotten. So I am glad that I picked it up again and really, really enjoyed it. Next up is my favorite of the month, which is really something considering I adored You Let Me In. This is The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison. I have been hearing amazing things about this book for years now. And I was like, this year's the year I read it. Oh my God, this is so good. The world building is just amazing. This tells the story of Maya, who is the youngest son of the elf emperor and also half goblin. He has pretty much been exiled from court, but when his father and brothers all die in an airship accident, he is suddenly thrown into the role of emperor. It's so good. The intricacies of the elf court, and then we get a visit from the ruler of the goblins, who is Maya's grandfather. The differences in the culture, the way that they speak, the way names work, there's just all this stuff, and it's such good world building, and I loved it so much. I don't know what else to say about it other than I adored it. This was so good, so well written. I was so invested in Maya as a character. He is such a sweetheart. This poor little 18-year-old who doesn't really know what he's doing at all and is just thrown into this role and is like, I don't really want to be here. I loved it. Obviously, this was a 5-star. It is gonna be somewhere on my top books of the year. I need to go through that and figure out what order things are going to be in, because there's just been so many amazing books this year that I'm like, oh my God, but this is definitely going to be on there. Next up was another reread, and this is The Bloody Chamber and Other Stories by Angela Carter. This is a book of mostly fairy tale retellings, although there are some that are less retellings and more just playing with various tropes. I actually had, I guess, read this in 2002 because I taught the story The Bloody Chamber. And so that was the class that my advisor came and observed me, and he thought I did such a good job that he asked me to come and talk to his Intro to Graduate Studies course because they were reading The Bloody Chamber as well. So I reread the story first, and then I was like, I'm just gonna read the whole book because I might as well. It's short, I really enjoy it. So this was 4 stars. I like some stories more than others. The Bloody Chamber itself is fantastic. I also really like The Courtship of Mr. Leon. And then my favorite is The Lady of the House of Love. Such a good story. These are creepy. They're very gothic. There's a lot of gothic going on this month. But yeah. I really enjoyed rereading them, and I had a wonderful conversation with the 3 new graduate students. There were only 3 of them. There's 2 PhD students and 1 master's student. So I really enjoyed going to the class and talking with them and kind of hearing their thoughts on it, and also giving them my thoughts and talking about what it was like to teach this. Because The Bloody Chamber is kind of hard to teach to a group of undergraduates. There is a lot of sexual elements that can be kind of uncomfortable to talk about in a classroom setting, especially for a group of like 18, 19-year-olds. So I shared my experience with that and kind of how I taught it and how I framed it and how they reacted, which was actually really positive. They really enjoyed this, so. Next up is one that I started in October for Victober, and that took me a very long time to read. Not because it's not good, but because it is just really long. This is The Daisy Chain, or Aspirations by Charlotte Mary Young. This book is a lot like Little Women, I feel like. We are following the May family, who have a grand total of, I think, 11 children. And right at the beginning of the story, there is a carriage accident that kills their mother, injures their father, and severely injures the oldest sister, Margaret, who is then paralyzed. So we are following just the lives of these children, mostly the older set. Margaret, Richard, Flora, Norman, and Ethel, but we also do see a fair amount of a few of the younger ones. So this book is broken into 2 parts. The first part is kind of dealing with, I guess, like the first year after the accident, maybe the first year and a half. And then the second part, we jump ahead 3 years. So the first part is really dealing with kind of their more childhood things. Whereas the second part, we are getting into some of them getting married and having careers and going to university. And I like the second half better than the first. I still enjoyed the first, but I feel like the second half is where the plot is very loose. But yeah, that's where the plot kind of comes in. Before that, it's kind of episodic. Not quite vignettes. Like, there is a through plot of Ethel trying to start a Sunday school and a church in the neighboring village of Coxmore, which is kind of uncivilized. There's no church there. It's very far for them to go to church, so most of them just don't. It's a very poor area. And so Ethel really wants to start a school, start educating the children, and try to get these people into a better place. And that is kind of the through line of the whole story. That and I would say, the accident and its consequences, particularly on the eldest sister, Margaret. It is very religious. That's actually why I picked it up for Victober, for Kate's challenge of reading a book where religion is a strong component. So there is that. I think some people find it too heavy with the religion and a little bit too sweet. I personally really enjoyed it. Again, it reminded me a lot of Little Women, and I think if you're a fan of Little Women, you would really like the Daisy Chain. So yeah, this was 4 stars. I had a good time. It is just really long. My Kindle copy was like, this is 500 pages. I'm like, this was longer than 500 pages. This was extremely long. But yeah, it was really good. 4 stars. Next up is another fairy tale retelling. This is The Mirror Season by Anna Marie McLemore. This is a very loose retelling of the Snow Queen, following 2 teenagers, Ciela and Locke, who are assaulted at the same party, and how they deal in the aftermath of that, how they go back to school, how they form first a friendship and then a romance, and how they come to terms with what has happened to them. This was really good. I love McLemore's work. I talked a bit about this in, it must have been a currently reading video, because I don't know when else I would have been talking about it. McLemore works in the genre of magical realism, so there are just some really interesting things with that. Ciela works at her family's Mexican bakery, and she is able to know what people want or need, even when they can't articulate that and don't even know what they want. So, and then she kind of loses this gift after the party and feels like she's kind of lost a piece of herself. There is also this whole thing with plants turning into shards of glass from a mirror, and it is just really interesting. I enjoyed it a lot. Maybe my second favorite by her. I've read 3 of hers so far, and Blanca and Roja is definitely my favorite, but I would say this is my second favorite. So yeah, this was 4 stars. Next up is another that counted for nonfiction November. This is Sisters of Charity, Catholic and Protestant, Abroad and at Home by Anna Jameson. This is a lecture from the Victorian era. Jameson was a writer kind of in the early to mid Victorian period, and this lecture is about how women should be allowed to work outside the home and how their kind of nurturing nature makes them ideal for certain types of work, nursing, teaching, etc. And basically arguing that women should not be confined to the home because that just doesn't work for some women and they need to go out and do something. So I was reading this for research for my dissertation. I would say really only the first 10 pages were useful for me for the dissertation work, but it was very interesting to read and it was very short anyway. So I'd also never read anything by Jameson, so reading something by her was interesting. I gave this 3 stars. There were parts where I kind of heavily skimmed, but ultimately it's worth looking at if that's a topic that you are interested in and you want to kind of learn more about proto-feminist movements from the mid-19th century. Next up, we have a library book. This is Graveyard Shift by M.L. Rio. So this is by the same author who wrote If We Were Villains, which I loved. I read that when it first came out. I actually followed M.L. Rio on her Tumblr back when she had one. So I watched the writing and creation and publication process of If We Were Villains through her Tumblr, which was really interesting. And she had not published anything except for one short story in a collection until this, which I was very excited to hear was coming out. It's very short. This follows several characters who all kind of have insomnia of some type and who meet up in a graveyard each night to smoke. They are all kind of based around this university campus. Some of them work for the university, some of them attend it, some of them just are in the area. And one day when they show up, there is a mysterious hole in the ground, in the graveyard, even though this is a graveyard where people are no longer buried. And this leads them into a whole mystery that I don't even know how to describe it. It starts a whole chain of events of them finding out about something that is going on at the university, and that is all I'll say. This needed to be longer. Like, I enjoyed it. I was having a great time. I was enjoying the characters. The premise was fascinating. But there wasn't enough. Like, the ending didn't feel like it accomplished anything. It felt like very anticlimactic, but also like just there was no delivering on a lot of the really great ideas that were in here. I wanted to know more. I wanted this to last longer than a day. It takes place over, I mean, God, less than 24 hours. I think we start at midnight. Yeah, we start at midnight and we end at and we end at 10 a.m. So less than 12 hours. I wanted it to last longer than that. It's like several days of them investigating this thing. I wanted to know more about these characters, and I wanted to see some of these relationships develop further and go more into their backstories because they were so interesting. Like, ML Rio created really interesting characters and had a really interesting premise, but I feel like there's a second half missing. So I ultimately gave this 3.5 stars because I did really like it. I think her writing is good. I thought the character work was interesting. It needed to be longer. It needed to be a novel, not a novella. So 3.5 stars. Then another library book, and this is We Used to Live Here by Marcus Klewer? This follows, what's her name? This follows Eve, who along with her girlfriend Charlie have bought this house for a deal, for like a complete deal, and they are going to renovate it and then sell it again. And of course, weird things are happening because weird things are always happening when you buy a house to like flip. Just don't flip houses is basically what I've learned between this and the Haunting of Hill House miniseries and several other things. Just don't flip houses. They're always haunted. So what happens here is a family shows up on their doorstep while Charlie is out. And the father says, oh, well, I used to live here and I was hoping I could show my family around. And Eve is pretty uncomfortable with this, but she is like the ultimate people pleaser. So she lets them in and then they just keep not leaving. And things start getting really weird. And that's all I'm gonna say because I don't know how else to describe it, and B, saying any more will like give away stuff. This is a ride that you just have to go on. So I also gave this one 3.5 stars. I was really engaged and interested. I did not feel that the writing was the best. I think that Cleaver, that's what we're going with. I think he relied too much on telling instead of showing us things about the characters. Like, there were so many aspects of Eve's personality that he just kind of told to us, when he could have easily done something small to show that and we would have picked up on it. I also didn't like that I didn't feel there was enough of an explanation behind what was happening. It was creepy as hell. Like, it was scary. But there wasn't enough, like, I'm like, but what was it? I still don't really know. And I did want a bit more of that. So again, like, it could have been longer. This is only 300 pages. It could have been longer and we could have gotten more information about what the actual hell is going on. So yeah, great creep factor. Very unsettling. Just not the best writing, and I wanted a little more from it. And then the final book that I finished was also for nonfiction November, and this is the autobiography of Harriet Martineau. So I was reading this for dissertation research to use in conversation with the autobiography of Margaret Oliphant. And this was also 3.5 stars. It was super interesting. Martineau lived a really fascinating life. She became deaf at a pretty young age. She dealt with a lot of illness. She was writing to support her family. She was a very, like, public woman of letters in the early Victorian era and before, because she started writing in the early 30s. So before Victoria took the throne. She knew so many different people. She was friends with Charlotte Bronte. I loved the section on that friendship. That was fascinating. And I had known it from kind of from Charlotte's perspective, I guess, because it's filtered through biographies of Charlotte Bronte that I had read and also letters from her. But seeing Martineau's take on the friendship was really interesting. I mean, God, she knew, like, everybody. Like, she knew Dickens, she knew Thackeray. Like, she just knew everyone. She also had this really interesting trip to America, where she was very anti-slavery, and she wrote about her stance. And she wanted to go to America and see slavery in action to further support her anti-slavery stance. So she went to America, she spent time in the North, she went into the South. That was a fascinating part of this book, and probably my favorite. There were just some parts that dragged a lot, especially when she's just kind of describing these people that she knew, who, like I said, she knew a lot of people, and some were more interesting than others. So some of the people that I didn't really know who they were, I was just like, eh. But yeah, her America trip was interesting. Her childhood was super interesting. And then she built a house in the Lake District. And that was also really interesting. Oh, she knew Wordsworth. She talks a lot about Wordsworth in here. So yeah, very interesting. But like a lot of Victorian nonfiction, especially long Victorian nonfiction, it kind of, there were parts that were less interesting to me. So 3.5 stars. So those were all of the books that I read, but I do want to talk about the 2 books that I DNF'd, because I have things to say about them. Sometimes I don't really have things to say about books that I DNF, but sometimes I do, and now is one of those times. So the first one is the one that led me to rereading House of Salt and Sorrows, and this is Lake's Edge by Lyndall Clipstone. Look at this cover. It's so pretty. I am so sad that I didn't like this. So this is a gothic fantasy. It's a young adult, which so is House of Salt and Sorrows, so that generally shouldn't matter, but sometimes it does. And this is following Violetta, who ends up going to the home of this guy named Rowan and his creepy estate Lake's Edge, and creepy things are supposed to be happening. And there was just no atmosphere at all. Like, such a lack of atmosphere and such a lack of character building and lead up to stuff. I think I stopped about 90 pages in, maybe, because I just wasn't, like, I felt nothing. No atmosphere, no nothing. I was disappointed, because when I have a gothic fantasy or any gothic book, I expect atmosphere, and this just didn't have it. I also expect character development and, like, interesting characters, because in a gothic story, you're usually very focused on the characters. Like, yes, creepy stuff is happening, but it's a usually character-driven story. And I found Violetta pretty annoying, to be honest, and dumb. So this was just a disappointment, because it's so pretty, and I really wanted to love it because this is so pretty. I mean, you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, obviously, but when a book is this gorgeous, like, so I'm gonna be donating this or giving it to a used bookstore so that maybe it can find a home with somebody who does like it, but I was very, very disappointed with this. And then the other book that I DNF'd is The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter by Theodora Goss. And this was on audiobook, read by Kate Redding. Redding? I don't know, it could be either. So this is a Victorian historical fantasy following a young woman named Mary Jekyll, who, yes, is the daughter of Dr. Jekyll. I DNF'd this really early on. I was like 2% in. And here's why. It's not that, like, because the premise sounds so interesting to me. And I've read stuff by Goss before, and I enjoy her. But, the way that it's structured is, like, apparently there is going to eventually be a group of girls, the daughter of Mr. Hyde, the daughter of Dr. Moreau, the daughter of Victor Frankenstein, etc., etc. And so it's framed as one of them is writing it, but they're all kind of gathered around. And then in the middle of the, like, you're reading the narration, and it'll just cut in with their comments about, like, oh, why are you doing it like this? Like, so it's really playing with structure, but it does not work on audiobook. Not for me, anyway. No. And I looked at the print copy, I looked at the ebook sample on Amazon, and I don't think I would even really enjoy reading it as a print copy, because it's just, like, it's not separated by, like, a chapter break. It's just, like, in the middle of the narration, you're suddenly getting these comments, like, kind of like a script. Like, it'll say Mary, and then whatever she said. Catherine, whatever she said. And I feel like something like every other chapter I could have dealt with that, but multiple times in the middle of, like, basically 5 pages because that's probably all I got through. It was just too much for me, and I didn't like it. So I DNF'd this. I own the second book in print copy, so I think I'm gonna be donating that, unless somebody in the comments tells me like this is really, really worth it and I should read it. Because like, I don't know, because I want to love it. It feels like one that I should love, but I just don't think I can deal with that. So I don't know. Have you read it? Let me know down in the comments if you think it's worth continuing. Obviously not with audiobook, but with a print copy. So those are the 13 books that I read and the 2 books that I did not finish in the month of November. Let me know down in the comments below. Have you read any of these? What did you think? Should I give The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter a second chance? What did you read in the month of November? If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to see more of my bookish content. It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon. Bye.